Hey everyone, this is Matt from howtogardendesign.com, back for step 2 in my Landscape Design Basics 6-Step Beginner Guide. So this one is 15 things you need to know before designing your garden. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but we'll get there. What I'm talking about is something called site analysis. Now, the reason I gave it that previous title is because people don't search for the word site analysis, but it is super important when it comes to any kind of garden design, any design in general, to be honest. And that's what we're going to explore in today's video is what is site analysis, how does it help you, and what do you need to know? So I break it down into, I guess, 3 different sections. One is things you want to know before you start designing, things you can learn as you explore different ideas, and things you may need to find out to inform experts later and help refine your design. So let's get into it. Before we begin designing, there's, I think, 8 or 9 different steps for this one. Let's have a look. One is have a base plan. We looked at that in step 1, in my step 1 video, so go check that out if you need to. Number 2 is we want to know the sun and path direction across your site, or I should say, where the sun, rises, how it travels across your site, and where it falls. And this helps inform a few different things, such as sunny and shady spots, particularly at different times of year. So for those of you who may be new to the area or who just didn't realize this, the rising and setting points change throughout the year. During summer, it generally rises further to the east, or I guess whatnot, and travels all the way along and then sets in a different position in the west, and it kind of moves throughout the year a little bit. So knowing that is useful because it means shadow directions will change throughout the year. So your shadow size, I guess, for different objects will lengthen and shorten, and where it actually positions will change as well. Same thing with sunny positions as well. We also want to know wind strength and direction, again, at different times of year. This can be really useful because depending on where you live, sometimes you've got a dominant wind that comes from the north, for example, at different parts of the year, and other times it might be the southwest. So knowing that information can be quite helpful for a few different reasons. Site gradient. This is an approximate one. I touched on it in the first video, but basically if you're on a slope, you want to have a rough indication of how steep your slope is, particularly if you've got different levels and different variations and gradients for your slope. Again, similar thing, high and low points on your site. Basically this tells you where water falls, where it will run from, and where it will run to and collect. Like I said here, water flow and pooling collection areas, generally in your low points, not always. Sometimes it'll be on a slope that for whatever reason has like a low point within it. It's not the lowest point of your yard, but water does pool and collect there and kind of gets stuck on its way down. So knowing those little bits and pieces, just doing a rough survey of your site, I think will be pretty helpful. Last one that I mentioned in the first video is when you've got noise or oversight from neighbors. So in this case, it could be things like if they've got windows or doors that look out into your property, you may want to cover those up depending on what you want to do outside. Also, maybe spots outside in their yard, so maybe they have an entertaining area that's close to a boundary that can look into your yard as well. Another thing is noisy areas. So if your neighbors are particularly noisy, or maybe neighbors further away are a little bit noisy, or maybe you live near a road that's actually quite noisy as well. I've written a few articles on how to deal with noise, so if you want you can check those out. Just Google how to garden design, and I think I did, noise reduction or landscape blocking noise or something along those lines. So there's a few examples there as well on how you can actually deal with that specific problem. But all this stuff I think is useful information to have before you begin designing, because it should help inform a couple of the decisions that you make, even just when it comes to actually positioning activities and features and different things that you want to do in your yard. So I'm not talking about the little nitty-gritty details. I'm talking about, well, you want to put an entertaining area over there, but it turns out that, neighbors look directly into the yard, or maybe that's the lowest point in your yard, so that's where water is going to collect, or maybe it's really noisy, right? So these are useful things that you can know right off the bat to help you when it comes to positioning things. As you design, soil conditions, so the type of soil and pH levels at multiple spots. The reason I think this is important as you design is that my design process, I generally think about how I want something to look or how I want it to function, and I care less. I don't start with a particular type of object. So in this case, I don't start with a plant and therefore need to know all the nitty-gritty stuff about how the plant will survive, what soil it needs. I tend to use plants later on, which sounds a bit weird, but that tends to be the process I go through. why I recommend it for people is that it's easy to get bogged down in trying to understand soil conditions and, pH levels and all of that. But what does that inform you? What does that actually tell you as, the designer in this case? It doesn't tell you a whole lot. You're better off finding that out as you go through. And I think taking that information to an expert, which is what I recommend. So they will be able to give you a lot more detailed information about, if you want a particular plant that has a particular color or aesthetic, you can then find out the type of soil, get your pH levels, take that to an expert during the design process once you've gone through a few iterations of different designs, and you can take that information to them and they'll be able to help you, match the criteria that you've set. Similar thing, rainfall. Again, rainfall is really useful to know. I'm not saying you shouldn't know it, but I don't know how that's going to change your design unless you're looking at a heavily engineered kind of backyard. And temperature ranges are another one. Again, I live in Canberra at the moment, where today it's 38 degrees, I think, Celsius, which is about 100 Fahrenheit. Extremely important information to know because it tends to give an upper bound on what kind of plants you want to select. You want to be able to select plants in particular, or materials, that can handle that kind of heat. So I don't want to select plants that are really, need a lot of water and will struggle in those temperatures, particularly over multiple weeks in summer. Same thing, I don't want to choose materials that are really dark color that are going to absorb all that heat, and then basically I can't walk across them barefoot because it's too black and too dark. So knowing that information is useful, but knowing it at the start, I think, can be too much. As long as you know those first things, you can actually get rolling. Once you get into the design process and start finding ideas and designs that you like, now you can start to look at this information and kind of use it to help refine edges and, I guess, soften edges and bits and pieces here and there. I mentioned talking to experts, so this is kind of like the final phase where you can take some information, take it to an expert, like I said, with the soil and pH levels, and it should help you refine choices and refine your design. So here's a good one, existing infrastructure and drainage. So whether you have that on your architectural plan would be useful, whether you know where certain things go in your yard, I think that's good to know. But unless you're a DIY person, often it's easier to take it to a landscaper and say, hey, by the way, this is the design I have so far, this is what I've worked on. I know there's a drainage point that runs through here, or maybe there's stormwater that goes through here. Just knowing that information is useful for them more so than for you. Again, construction techniques are another thing, whether you need it for engineering, so that's going to be a lot more expensive, but maybe you have a retaining wall that's greater than 1 meter, or I guess 3 feet in height. Generally, if that's the case, you need engineering in order to get a building permit, which you need to actually build it. So that's a bit beyond what you need to know right from the beginning, right? But knowing construction techniques or doing the research as you go can be really, really useful. Same thing if you're doing DIY. Most people, when it comes to designs, I think, design from their own level of competence, which can often be quite low, and kind of forget that as you build, you will get better at building. So stretch a little bit. So if you're doing a DIY design and you're just doing a simple little deck, maybe you can make the deck a little bit more elaborate. And so as you go, you can research these construction techniques and go, oh, okay, well, I originally had my deck just being level and boring and kind of flat and nothing, but now having done my design and actually really liking this particular deck that has multiple levels on it, just stepping down, I actually want to build that. So what does that look like? And then you read more on the construction techniques for how to do that, and either you realize that A, you won't be able to, in which case you scale it back, or B, actually, you know what? Maybe I can get away with that. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking of here. You don't need to know how to construct everything right from the beginning. Native plants and animals. This is an unusual one, but I think it's really important. I think as the world gets a little warmer, having plants that can survive in your local environment is really useful. So native plants generally fit that bill, whether they're indigenous, so local to your area, or whether they're just native to your country or region, I think is really, really good. Another thing is animals. So I think we don't really think about it, but having animals visit your yard is really lovely, and some people, that's what they want. So this is research you can do later on, where when it comes to potentially filling out some of those more niche areas, so this is a really common one where you've got a lot of space, you don't really know what to do with it, so you just think, oh, a garden bed. Okay, cool. A garden bed would be nice if you can throw in some native plants that are very low maintenance, but also attract animals to your yard, and it gives you a bit more life in that space, I think is really useful. Again, you don't need to know all this at the start. You can kind of reach these decisions as you go through the design process. Lastly, extreme weather events. again, this is extremely useful to know, but how it informs your design process, particularly at the beginning, can be a bit challenging. So I think a good example here would be bushfires, right? Like there's not a lot I can do from a design perspective for bushfires. Maybe it would change my selection in terms of certain plants or trees. Gum trees generally just light up like matchsticks because they're designed to do that, I should say. So maybe I would move away from some of those and opt for something slightly different that is less flammable, or maybe move it away from a building, which is what I should be doing, because if a gum tree catches fire and it's next to a building, it can easily lead to embers and things falling on the roof, which will then catch fire, so a bit more dangerous. Maybe where you live, it's blizzards, right? And you have to think about where things are positioned. But the reason I put it here, as you're refining and talking to experts, is that trying to create a design with all this information at once can be really challenging. It's the kind of thing that you lay that information on later on. So you look at a design or two that you've already done and you go, oh, okay, cool. How would this design cope with extreme amounts of snowfall or tornadoes or whatever it is? And tornadoes is an interesting one, because if we go back, man, it's going to take a little while. In terms of the wind strength and direction, I mentioned that wind strength and direction can change. So how do you design with that? Well, one thing would be, again, I'm going to use a personal example. In where my parents live in Melbourne, really, really hot summer days, they get a north wind that comes in. It blows all across the country. It's very, very hot. It can hit 40, 45 degrees, 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's strong. And how I would design around that would be to make sure I don't have any kind of solid flat surfaces that run east-west that are liable to kind of be blown over. So whether it's a screen or something like that, that in those really hot summer days would be liable or dangerous to kind of blow over. And similar thing, depending on where you live, if you have hurricanes or tornadoes, those kind of things, just think about where you're positioning kind of flat surfaces so that should those extreme events occur, you're not suddenly going to be in danger of something flying across and smashing into your building or potentially hurting someone. So here's a list of all the 15 things that I think we need to know. As I mentioned, kind of you got your first 8. Oh, there we go. First 8, then your next kind of 3, and then your last couple as you're designing. But realistically, if you're interested, you can research them all at the start. I just wanted to make it a little bit easier for you. So let's look at some examples. This is a base plan that I think I mentioned in the first video, where it's not great, but basically the idea for it, as we'll explore in later videos, is for a wheelchair-friendly garden. So someone who uses a wheelchair, can we create something that, is really nice and still usable for them without being too challenging? So this is just a really simple example of some site analysis. Basically what we've done is we've got to look at some morning sun that comes from this direction, evening sun comes from this direction, nothing crazy there. I think I tried to put in some hatching to show where shade would be at different times of the day. Pretty obvious, really. Probably the only thing that we've got here is like this could get a bit shady in the afternoon, depending on if you wanted to use that area or not. And again, we've got a slight slope here. I tried to do these little dashed lines that show topography. Again, this is just a made-up site, so don't take anything too crazy, but you can see I've made a note here of occasional breezes coming from the west, and this is the lowest point in the site, so water will generally flow and pool in this area. Really simple, nothing too crazy. Probably the last one is, we've got slight neighbour oversight. So neighbours that can look into this area. So maybe that's something we want to look at later. Here is a design that I was looking at, garden design for a hot climate. And again, nothing too super crazy here. One note I made is that the building radiates heat onto the ground on the west and southern sides. I'm pretending this property is in America, in the northern hemisphere. So we've got a lot of heat, afternoon sun coming in, and the building's going to radiate heat onto the landscape itself, which adds to the heat that the land is already experiencing from the sun. Coolest side of the house happens to be on the northern side and maybe a little bit in here. So these I've made a note here as opportunities to have what I call cool areas. So if you want plantings that aren't just succulents, for example, maybe these are spots where you could look to plant some of those because they're going to have the most protection from the heat and the sun. Again, sometimes we've got afternoon breezes that kind of flow across the site. These areas here, I've made a note, are most exposed to the wind, so that's something you have to think about. And then, again, I just made a yellow note here saying these parts of the yard have most exposure to sun. So just this knowledge is like, all right, well, if that's something I have to think about, that's going to influence my material choice. It's going to influence how I lay things out, potentially what activities I want to do in those spaces. So that's the kind of information that you want to know right off the bat. This one, I think, is the first example that I've got of some site analysis around the side of my parents' house. So I looked at this base plan earlier in part 1, but you can see here I've made points, little notes. Let's start with this one. So occasional strong winds that kind of blow through here. That's that north wind I was talking about before, where every now and then in summer you'll get these really hot winds that blow through this area. Mostly it kind of is a cool breeze that comes through this way, particularly in winter, not too bad. I think in this area I've made a note of summer afternoon sun that hits this area here, and also a little bit of afternoon sun that kind of peeks over the building into this area here as well. I've made a note here of potential neighbour noise. This is something I mentioned before, where this is their kind of entertaining area. It's mostly well covered, but realistically you can get some noise kind of flowing into this area. Now this is a utility space, so I'm not too worried about that, but it's just something to note. Here is something a little more esoteric that we're going to touch on in later videos, but the idea here is that this is a brick wall. It's actually a 2-story brick building, and the wall glows during summer afternoons. So I made a note of that. You'll see in later videos about why I made that point, but it's just something that I really like and something that I want to look at potentially incorporating into my design in some way later on. Sounds a little weird incorporating something that's off your property into a design, but you'll see what I mean. Last notes here, I guess, I mentioned occasional strong winds. Water drains toward the backyard, so it's just a very slight slope. The other thing here is there's a low point around the heater, so whatever we were trying to implement, whether we wanted to do kind of like a French drain or something that goes down the middle to collect water, you'd have to recognize that you want to make sure that you put something here, like a slight slope or barrier, to prevent water pooling in this area, or just another way that you can potentially get a drain in to collect water in this direction. I don't think it's too much of an issue because it's mostly covered by eaves, but it's just something to make a note of. Here's another one I made of this same plan, which is, again, neighbours' oversight. So their kitchen window and bathroom window in the second floor look out into this space. Again, I'm not super worried because it's mostly a utility area, but if we want to make it nice, maybe these are things we want to look at trying to address. And the same thing here is the view out of these bedrooms. So more or less this bedroom here looks in this direction, and the centre of the thing, so their centre view is kind of this spot. Same thing for this bedroom and same thing for this bedroom. So these are things you might want to think about when it comes to your own design. And I think this is the last slide I've got here. This is just an example I used of from my book, and it's basically just looking at summer. So we've got rainfall and wind in summer. So I made a note, wind comes from the southwest during summer months, roughly 60% of the time. Less than 10% of the days have high winds from the north-northwest. Again, that's that hot northwesterly breeze. And it actually turns toward the south during February. So that's kind of what these arrows represent, I think, for the most part. So roughly where the wind direction comes from. So nothing too crazy, but you can see I've changed the size of the arrows, I think, to represent strength of the wind potentially. And then I've also made a note here of rainfall. So we've got average rainfall. This is one I mentioned you don't need to know from the start necessarily. I've changed my tune on that a little bit. Previously I thought you need to know it, but again, how's it influencing what decisions you're actually making? I don't think a lot, because rain will just happen. Like maybe you want to collect the rain, that's fine. That can be part of the design process from the beginning, I guess. But usually that kind of infrastructural thing is something you can lay into designs as you go, rather than have to design right from the start, if you get what I mean. So here there's just average rainfall in millimeters. You can see January is the lowest, and the highest recorded rainfall recording according to Bureau of Meteorology, when I looked at this a few years ago, was 41 mils. I'm guessing in an hour. I think that's what it was. 103 mils in Feb and 108. So January obviously doesn't get as much rain as the other months. Again, useful information. How it's influencing how I design something is a little more challenging and tricky. But I think that's it for step 2. Again, it was predominantly just around site analysis. So the stuff I think you should know before you design, stuff you can kind of research during your design process, and stuff you can either take to experts when you need to, or you can find out later on when you're trying to refine things. So that's it for now. Join me in step 3, where we look at how to use some of this design knowledge, I guess, this site analysis, to actually help make some decisions about how we're going to approach problems and take advantage of opportunities. So I'll see you then.